Breath of the Wild does an incredible thing every so often while you're exploring a particularly calm area. If you think about time passing in Breath of the Wild as measured by the space between interesting locations or encounters, you could probably put this moment directly at the center of that interval. It's right after all the dust settles from your last discovery, yet right before you decide it's time to start searching for something interesting once again. You may have figured it out by now, but it's the moment that these notes play. At points in the last few years where I've been particularly stressed, I think about this moment a lot. To me, it somehow communicates an all-encompassing calmness and an intangible reassurance that could only be speaking to the player alone. If I had to give it a name, it would probably be something like empowered solitude. In this brief 5-second moment, I found myself entirely settled into Breath of the Wild's world and my motives within it without any outside influences. Surprisingly, in spite of the overwhelming nature of this feeling, the only cue for it to occur was a brief injection of piano. If you think about it practically, it actually makes a lot of sense why this works. I'm no expert on musical theory, but from what I can tell, the notes played here are in nature hopeful. Yet, if the game was very direct about denoting that, then you'd no longer be alone. As such, rather than the music being explicitly hopeful, like Hyrule Field for example, it subtly pushes you to think about yourself in an optimistic way. Now, Breath of the Wild is far from a bleak game, much unlike some of the other examples of this feeling I can think of. But one thing about the game that is undeniable is its immense scale and lack of direction. Its scale isn't scary or daunting in any way, but it does do an excellent job of letting you know that you're on your own. I think a major strength of Breath of the Wild is that in spite of the scale and loneliness, the game never feels bleak. In fact, it goes a long way to make sure that you know that even on your own, you're perfectly capable of exploring wherever you desire. There are the obvious explicit choices that show this, such as how the game teaches you its many systems early on and allows you to interact with them in interesting ways, frequently helping to get the player through a tough encounter. Similarly, the game doesn't tell you the exact numbers behind an enemy's health bar until you get a piece of gear, encouraging you to test whether or not you're actually capable of taking an enemy on without discouraging you with large enemy health pools right off the bat. While I do think these both work to great effect in bolstering player confidence, I truly believe that the subtle tonal choices in the moment-to-moment gameplay are what make this feeling ultimately tangible. The aforementioned piano notes are the easiest example, but there's also the equally important sound design that exists entirely separate from the music. The emphasis on weapons clanking together on your back or the ground crunching beneath your feet serve to make the majority of what you're hearing that which is only audible due to your actions. You found those weapons that you can hear. You ventured into that crunchy snow, and the game wants to let you know that what you can hear is because of you. It does all of this in a subtle, atmospheric, and ultimately pretty calming way. By subtly encouraging the player and their actions, Breath of the Wild empowers you to venture through its lonely world. Admittedly, Breath of the Wild is a strange choice to begin this video talking about, as its lack of challenge can make it difficult to understand why empowerment is even important. Much unlike some other particularly empowering games I can think of, Breath of the Wild's world makes you feel like you actually belong in it, and satisfaction doesn't come from existing in a space that's trying to kill you. Now, that said, triumph over difficulty and stacked odds can be incredibly empowering in itself, and an intense difficulty can definitely inspire the same player pride as I've described in Breath of the Wild, especially in the face of Solitude. People talk about how challenging Dark Souls is way too much, but I don't think people put enough emphasis on what that challenge actually does to enhance the play experience. A challenge can serve just as important of a role as loneliness in making the player feel like their actions are something that they have total agency over. The more solitary you are in your own achievement, especially when it's difficult, the more self-satisfaction there is in perseverance. As you become more proficient at upgrading your weapons as well as dodging and rolling, your confidence going into an undoubtedly challenging boss fight increases. I think that this really clicks the moment you beat Taurus Demon. Despite this fight occurring earlier in the game, it's still incredibly tough. It serves as essentially a skill check, making sure that you are settled into the groove of combat that you'll need to perfect throughout the entire game. It serves this purpose quite well, because once you do it, you'll know for sure that you can make it through this game's bosses. I've never met anybody who has gotten past this boss in Dark Souls and hasn't finished the game entirely. This moment is a great example of how challenge feeds into self-satisfaction, which then in turn feeds into confidence and empowerment. Eventually, you'll reach a point where you stop thinking about Dark Souls in terms of its infamous difficulty and more in terms of player-driven exploration and discovery. A transition from perceiving the things around you as threats and feeling empowered enough to begin seeing them as opportunities. While that sense of being able to handle a challenge on your own can be incredibly useful in crafting the feeling of empowered solitude, that's not to say that the game profusely engenders confidence. In fact, the game world is designed with something that is at odds with confidence entirely as a major component: unknowability. For example, the fog gate. It's a simple yet effective visual reminder that you can't possibly know what awaits you in this world. While daunting at first, Dark Souls' gradual confidence gain ensures that you don't feel overwhelmed by the coming challenge. Your knowledge and wealth of technical progression up until that point ensure that eventually you'll be able to overcome it. Dark Souls nails this feeling spatially as well. It's certainly an interesting game to talk about when it comes to the idea of scale and empowered loneliness, at least in comparison to how it's conveyed in Breath of the Wild. When you start out, the game is immeasurably large and dangerous. Twisting passageways and alternate paths seem to run infinitely, with obtusely designed enemies at every turn. Much like Breath of the Wild, the game world can eclipse you in its scale and complexity, granted to a much larger degree than Zelda. Dreary environments and hauntingly silent ambiences amplify the anxiety of traversal that Breath of the Wild only hints at, not even giving you the luxury of relief that Breath of the Wild's soundtrack frequently does. Its game world is disempowerment personified, and yet somehow that disempowerment can be reveled in as independence. As you begin to map out the interconnected hallways of the game's labyrinthian design in your head, you realize that you never needed a map to begin with. The forced independence during traversal empowers you to navigate on your own. While Dark Souls' empowerment largely focuses on either combat or traversal, that isn't to say that it doesn't have its atmospheric Breath of the Wild moments either. My favorite example of this is the moment you enter the deepest part of the map, Ash Lake. Seeing an endless horizon of underground ocean is possibly the most intimidating sight in the entire game by design. The sky in this area is entirely obscured, and while this is not the only area in the game that does this, it is the only one that has personally conveyed to me that you are so far underground that not even the world knows where you are. All of this said would give an outsider to Dark Souls the impression that this area is no different from that which they had experienced prior: silent, devoid of direction, and decrepit. And yet so antithetically, when you enter, this music plays. This area does not lead anywhere. It is simply a relic of a time long since dead. It's one of 3 locations in the game with music, and it houses the last known dragon in all of Dark Souls' world. It is desolate, it is tragic, it is dead, and yet somehow you were meant to be here. This music makes sure that you know that. When I was here for the first time, I witnessed my outlook change. This was not desolation, but a fascinating new opportunity to experience beauty. You're alone on this journey, and you will be until the very end. But in this moment, knowing you've made it past multiple bosses, and knowing you've managed to navigate here all on your own, you're empowered. The next steps to take from these games are relatively clear. There's a certain degree of loneliness that games that take place on land can convey, but until you're truly ungrounded, loneliness from what is familiar never really sets in. This is why naturally the next steps in conveying empowered solitude are games that take place off of land, in space. Take a game like Space Engine, for example. Its 2-scale representation of space is so overwhelming and existentially isolating that you can't help but marvel at your own incredible insignificance. Unapologetically lonely games like that aren't empowering in any way, and while Space Engine does have its truly beautiful moments, they serve more to simulate than to incite exploration. One step further and you have something like Elite Dangerous, which is already more deeply personal due to the player actually exploring from the cockpit of a ship. In spite of this, however, the game fails tremendously in its communication of its systems and features, making the only loneliness you feel stem from the fact that you're not as knowledgeable as the rest of the player base. On top of that, it's a shared world, so you never get the sense that you're truly on your own to make it through a situation. A lot of early successes here you don't owe to your own skill, whether it be a tutorial or a streak of luck that lends you an easy mission and some credits. Then you have Prey. Prey is the most deliberate and well-done example I can think of when it comes to conveying loneliness in space. It strings you along through this whole elaborate opening sequence, only to slap you in the face with this uncannily empty space station by contrast. Warm lighting and large communal areas are contrasted by quiet desolation, both inside and out of the Talos 1 space station. At times it feels almost like you're in a mall past closing time. Mimics hide in plain sight like security cameras, and phantoms roam the halls with an imposing, haunting stature. The station itself creaks and groans, instilling this sense that this massive Colossus station has been dangerously hurt or is in some way ill. There's a palpable dread that sets in once you recognize that the Talos 1 station wants you off of it just as much as you want off of it yourself. In terms of gameplay, Prey takes a similar approach to Breath of the Wild. It gives you an insane amount of options in tackling an objective, yet never makes the player feel like they're being led towards one or the other. This freedom, in contrast with the oppressive backdrop of Talos 1's inherent psychological horror, is what makes you feel empowered. You're making your own path through this station's story, on your own terms and by your own means. It's a strangely liberating feeling that could only exist in a space where you're confined. I would liken it somewhat to how it feels to be home alone as a kid. In both cases, the space that you're in feels uncannily large, and like there should be more people buzzing about than just you, going about their routines. But there aren't. Once again, much like being home alone as a kid, the most empowering feeling is knowing that you have free reign over this domain in the face of your own solitude. A few hours in, Prey does something that solidifies this feeling to a remarkable degree. After gathering the proper equipment inside of Talos, you're given the opportunity to exit via an airlock and start drifting around the outside of the space station in unrestricted zero gravity. At this point, Talos 1 in all of its jaw-dropping physicality is entirely vulnerable. You are given the opportunity to glide past any location in the entire game, interacting with numerous secrets and passageways driven by only your own personal sense of exploration. In addition, the exterior of the station has the potential to be just as, or even more terrifying than the interior. The muted sound limits your perception, amplifying the moment-to-moment dread to an intense degree. The environmental storytelling is incredibly poignant as well, with adrift corpses and eerily stagnant debris magnifying just how desolate the station has become. The game fully recognizes this poignance too, as the track labeled No Gravity by Mick Gordon serves to make this scene even more awe-inspiring. Among all of this, however, you'll explore the aftermath of the Talos 1 disaster in the most complete picture of it that exists. You will effectively make your way through the space where others before you were doomed to fail. This feeling of progressing through ruin by your lonesome is an independence that exists only because of the desolation surrounding it. And now, outside of this behemoth space station, not even gravity has the force to restrain you. For as many varied examples as I've gone through in this video, I actually haven't yet shown my first inspiration for making it. This is largely because I believe it's the best encapsulation of the feeling I'm describing, and funnily enough, it's one that you've almost definitely seen before. The title screen for The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time perfectly encapsulates empowered solitude in every sense of the phrase. The game is all about this singular solitary quest, and no other area better exemplifies that than the expanse of Hyrule Field. The music, ambience, and sound design on this screen represent the quiet, self-reflective travel inherent to this journey, and visuals of Link riding his horse towards his next destination carry with it this distinct sense of purpose. Ocarina of Time is far from the first game to use the cliché of going off on your own, and as a direct result of its existence, was far from the last to do it as well. I definitely feel like there's a reason for this though, especially when you notice the same tropes being used in games so frequently. Personally, I believe this is because the abstract feeling of empowered loneliness is exactly how you're meant to feel on an adventure, and as such is used as a trope incredibly frequently. In fact, the Legend of Zelda series practically birthed the action-adventure genre, in no small part due to how the games make you feel solitarily empowered. Essentially what I'm trying to say here is that this feeling is inherent to the medium of video games and will likely continue to be a staple for years to come. One of the reasons people play games in the first place is to have a sense of agency over these worlds they inhabit. What better way to instill agency than to allow people to bask in their own achievements as a solitary hero? Thank you for watching.